Hello, I'm so pleased today to be able to introduce Mike Restoule to you. I want more people to know who Mike Restoule is, and I'll tell you why. There's a treaty that covers the territory that I live on, that I'm raising my family on, and the place where I work, and that treaty is called the Robinson Huron Treaty, and it was made in 1850. What had happened was there was Anishinaabe folks living here, and they were, among other things, they would mine minerals in this territory. But then some settlers came, not to settle, but to mine, and they started setting up shop and mining. And the leadership here said, you can't do that unless we have come to an agreement. And part of that agreement is going to be that if we let you mine here, you're going to have to share some of your revenues with us. And this seemed logical to everyone. And so the representatives of the Robinson Huron communities sat down with the British and they made a treaty called the Robinson Huron Treaty in 1850. Now, one of the terms of that treaty, I'm going to read it to you, it's legalese, but I think you'll be able to follow the gist. It said, the British promised that if at any future period this land should produce such an amount as will enable the government of the province, without incurring loss, to increase the annuity hereby secured to them being the Anishinaabe, then, and in that case, the same shall be augmented, increased, from time to time. And clauses like this do occur in lots of different kinds of treaties, agreements, contracts, and they're sometimes referred to as an escalator clause. So it takes into account that things might change in the future, and that if one side benefits, then the other side will benefit as well. So the Robinson Huron communities have never been asleep to the fact that this clause has not been held up, but now we are at a point in 2018 where that injustice has been brought to the courts. And the story of how that injustice came to be brought to the courts involves many people, and one of the people it involves is Mike Restoule from Nipissing First Nation. And so what he's going to share with us today is how a group's understanding of an injustice turns into real action, which turns into a court case, which will bind the future actions of the people of Ontario. So how we go from injustice to action, and then hopefully to change. So I want to start by saying thank you, Miigwech, Mike, for coming. It's very kind of you to spend this time with us.
You're quite welcome.
Would you be willing to tell us the story before you were part of the story? How did this movement start?
You know, this movement started actually in 1851. After the treaty was signed in 1850, a lot of patents for mining were being given out by the government, by the Crown, to begin mining operations in the territory. And the First Nations, the Ojibwe people thought, well, okay, that's great. You know, whatever is happening, we're going to share in those, in the revenue from that. Well, it never happened. And then finally, in 1851, Chief Shigwakons, who was one of the original negotiators in the treaty, said to the Crown, you were supposed to increase the treaty, increase the annuity based on activity, revenue that you're getting from the territory. Well, it just didn't happen. That fell on deaf ears, and it happened over and over and over again. Leadership from all of the First Nations around the territory began to press Crown officials to increase the annuity. It never was. Finally, in 1874, the Crown said, yes, you're right. The treaty should be increased. We will increase it to $4 per person. because there's a section in the treaty that says that it would be the limit per person to be given out individually would be £1. And in that time it was $4. So $4 was a lot of money, I guess, in those days, you know. And so they were satisfied with that for a while, but then following that, there were no further increases. The chiefs kept pressing the government officials for further increases in the annuity. Then they began to hear the story that no, $4 is the maximum. So that kept on and on and on and on until finally, sometime in the 1970s, First Nation leadership from the territory decided it's enough.
After 100 years.
Yeah, that's right. You know, after 100 years of asking them to follow the terms of the treaty, they're not doing it. So it's time for us to take them to court. But at the same time, there was a big event happening with the Canadian government. The Pierre Trudeau government wanted to patriate a constitution for Canada. In other words, for Canada to become a nation, to have its own constitution. So
I'm going to do a historian's interlude here. I know this is surprising to some people, but up until 1982, the British Parliament had the last word on our laws and our policies, I guess, right? So they were legally in charge of our Constitution. So as part of Trudeau's sort of patriotic movement, he promised that he would take that power back to this nation state, and that the authority of the Queen and the Crown in Canada would be severed.
So, you know, knowing that that's about to come about, a lot of the First Nation leadership across Canada began to be concerned what happens with our treaty rights if responsibility for treaties switches over to a Canadian government rather than the British Crown. They wanted to assure that something was going to solidify that in the new constitution. So what happened is a group of chiefs went to England to go to visit the Queen and talk to the Queen about the treaty and specifically about the annuity and how the annuity should be augmented from time to time. Well, when they got there, they didn't get an audience with the Queen. They met with an official there, and who listened to the story and said, "Thank you very much for coming. It was a nice story, and I really enjoyed meeting with you today." That was it. So when they come back, they said, "Well, I think we better start some action to get our court case going." So that went on for a long time, from the early '80s to the 1990s. What happened is the action started with the Union of Ontario Indians, because the Union of Ontario Indians had treaty dollars that were transferred over to the Union of Ontario Indians to do treaty research. So they began using that money for treaty research. And then when they decided they were going to use that money to take a court case against Canada, well, that was a big no-no. You can't use that money for that purpose. So then what happened is the First Nations then decided that they got to find their own money to take this to court. So, long story short.
No, we want the long story long. Come on, it's a good story.
Right. So anyway, 1992, I was elected to the Council of Nipissing First Nation, and one of my first tasks was to attend a meeting of the Lake Huron Regional Chiefs meeting. And this was, I recall that it was in Sudbury. Can't remember the place in Sudbury, but I do remember that it was in Sudbury. So I went there and listened to what was happening, and then when I came back and reported back to the chief and council, the chief said to me, I want you to continue to attend all of these meetings and work on our behalf in this process. So I started from there, 1992, and here I am today. But in between that, there was a lot of information, a lot of things that happened.
So was that chief, are we talking about Jerry Bocage or Margaret Panasset?
That was Chief Jerry Bocage, who was the chief at the time when I was elected in 1990. And then when after he had a 2-year term, and then Chief Margaret Panassi Mai became the chief, and she reaffirmed my responsibility to attend those meetings on behalf of Nipissing First Nation.
And I just want to return to that first time you went to the Lake Huron Regional Chiefs meeting. I think you've told me this twice now. You said after that meeting, after hearing the story and where they were at in the struggle, you made up your mind. I've heard you use that phrase twice. You made up your mind that you were going to stay with this issue. And I also heard you say that you decided specifically to stay in contact with people on this issue.
That's right. Yeah, because even though I had other things, I had a full-time job for one thing, working on the railway, and then I had most of my evenings were pretty busy with the council work, but I still had time to attend these meetings and keep in touch with these people that were discussing ways of moving the issue forward.
And I do just want to pause there and just highlight what Mike's just sharing. So I think lots of folks can get kind of overwhelmed and they think, how can we make change? How can anything be different? And I hear a lot of people on the one hand discouraged and on the other hand talking about busyness. So what we've just heard is that someone who had a full-time job, was also serving on council at Nipissing First Nation, found time to begin a long-term commitment just on the level of communication and sharing information on a specific issue, and somehow was able to perceive of himself as having time for that, not being overwhelmed. Any comment on why you felt were you overcommitting, or did you see something?
Well, I saw the issue, and the issue was part of me. It was within my spirit. I knew this had to be done, and I don't know where that impetus came from. Probably from some of my relatives, that talked with me. Some of the ancestors maybe came to me to see me in a dream. I don't know, but it became a part of me, and I knew I wanted to get this thing going and get it resolved. It was a long journey to get the case into the courts. When you got 21 First Nations who are basically autonomous in what their decisions are, to try to get them together on one process to move an issue forward is not an easy task.
It's a lot of moving parts.
We found that out, yes. It's a lot of moving parts. And the trouble with that is most of the First Nations, I think at that time, all of the First Nations were under a 2-year term for their council and First Nation chiefs. And so every 2 years, some of those First Nations were being re-elected. People were gone away. The people that started to work on this were gone away. Other people came in. They had different ideas. We had to take steps back and say, okay, we'll take a step back and we'll start the process all over again, and we'll regather and we'll discuss how we're going to move forward. And it kept changing and changing and changing. It was so difficult to get one process, agree on one process to move the issue forward. So we had some lawyers that were working with us at the time. They did their best, they did their best given the situation that we were in. And they they worked at trying to unify the First Nations to come to terms with how we're going to proceed into trial with this issue. It wasn't very successful. The First Nation chiefs got frustrated, and finally they said amongst themselves, we're going to look for a legal team, a legal firm that's really somebody that we can rely on to move this thing forward, somebody who believes that this ought to be settled once and for all. So what they did at the time is they formed what we called litigation working committee. And that litigation working committee of 6 people were to put together a request for proposals to seek out a new law firm.
And you told me about how you just. I asked you what were you looking for because you were made the chair of that
That's right.
group, and I asked you what were you looking for in these law firms.
Well, it's not all my ideas. I worked with the chiefs, with the committee, to determine just what we need. What kinds of things do we want a law firm to understand and to do for us to move this case forward? So we took all of those ideas and I drafted them into a request for proposals. We gave it back to the chiefs in assembly, and the chiefs agreed with it, and they said, yes, this is the process that we should go to. So then we asked the chiefs, rather than send it out to all across Canada, we said that's not very productive. We should be selective in who we think.
So very strategic.
That's right. Who we think would be good lawyers, law firms to take this case on. And so we had, I think it started out with 11 legal firms answer the call. We narrowed that down to six law firms, and those 6 law firms, what we did then is we gathered around a table, and the litigation working committee took the time to review the submissions based on a set of criteria that I had developed because we had all these principles that we wanted. So I developed a criteria and a scoring mechanism so that we could determine which law firm would be the best for us to approach to take this case. So we did that, and we came up with a law firm, and we presented our findings to the chiefs. The chiefs agreed to it, and they asked us to contact the law firm and to bring the law firm to a meeting with the chiefs. And the process started to move forward.
And to me, when you talked about this sounds like this is when things started moving quickly.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. The law firm that we engaged is a law firm of Nawagabo Corbiere, and they're currently headquartered out of Rama First Nation. And they brought some ideas about how, when they first came on, they saw the problems that we were having, trying to unite all of the First Nations to get together. And it wasn't easy to do that. There was a lot of different issues, and there was this constant changeover, chiefs and councillors, and each one coming back in and different ideas, different ways of doing things, and we just kept having to take steps backwards and start again, you know. And so, anyway, the the law firm came up with this idea of creating a trust and a board of trustees that would be given the mandate to take the case forward into court.
So empowered by the chiefs.
Empowered by the chiefs.
And trusted by them so that not every decision
That's
had
right.
to be made by committee of the whole.
That's right. And they drafted a trust indenture. We reviewed that with the chiefs, went over it line by line, and in the end, they all agreed that this was the process that we should use to move the case forward. What that did then, it took it aside from what the chiefs were normally doing. So it didn't matter whether there would be turnover amongst the chiefs and councils. This trust continued with the work. There was no interruption in the work, and it just continued. There was difficulties in getting funding. You know, it was difficult for the First Nations to provide money to the trust to keep the work going, because, you know, hiring lawyers, hiring researchers, historians to gather evidence to prepare the case for court is a huge undertaking. It was a huge undertaking.
And this is coming out of those 21 nations' pockets.
That's right. That's at the start, you know, and we did that, and we got, you know, we ended up we got enough money from the First Nations to at least to do the research and to pay the lawyers. And the lawyers were really good. The lawyers agreed with us. What we did is we negotiated a partial contingency arrangement where the lawyers would work for half their salaries to work for us to get the case into court. But in the end, there would be a contingency to so that they could recoup their their salaries in the end.
So that must have felt like a vote of confidence to you.
That's right.
Do you know what I mean? If they're willing to do that, that must have told you they feel like they've got a chance at this.
That's right, yeah, because what that law firm did is they gave us 5 different legal opinions on the case. And they said that this case looked really solid to them, that they had a really good chance to win this in court. So when we brought this trust indenture to the chiefs, they agreed to that, and that was in 2010. We established the Robinson Huron Treaty Litigation Fund, of which I was appointed the chair.
There's a theme.
I'm
seeing a theme. I want to back up a little bit. You talked about, because one of the things that happens, you've talked about one struggle going forward, which was the constant re-education and, I guess, re-lobbying of the new leadership, because and I'm assuming it was the Indian Act that was forcing the communities to re-elect the leadership every 2 years.
That's right.
Right? So this isn't a conversation about that, but that is a colonial strategy to undermine the political authority of Indigenous folks, is to destabilize the leadership. And so we've got a group who is seeing that strategy and recognizing that the way to resist the strategy is through patience and perseverance of a kind of unbelievable level. You identified another snag along the way, and that was that there were 17 communities that signed the Robinson Huron Treaty, but by now there are 21 Robinson Huron communities, which makes it confusing to figure out who is part of the law case and in what status, what their status is.
Yeah. The treaty talks about communities along the north shores of Lake Huron and Lake Superior. And at the time that the treaties were made, those were the people that they talked with. Those people that were... So there were people living on Manitoulin Island who were not engaged in the process.
The 1850 process.
That's right,
yeah.
The 1850 process. So what happened then is since since 1850, our people scattered all over the place, and they became members of all these different communities, and these different communities became First Nations under the Indian Act, and these chiefs and councils became responsible for the members, some of whom were treaty annuitants, people that were entitled to the annuity on a yearly basis, and um, so we had to find a way to deal with that. Well, some of the First Nation communities said no, this is only about the North Shore communities, not about the ones on Manitoulin Island. It was about the North Shore communities. So there was kind of a division there, you know, and it was really a tough situation to get over. We engaged a historian to look at what happened in the past as to why some of these First Nations, some of these communities became First Nations and were included under the Robinson Huron Treaty. And there were such things as adhesion, you know, things like that resulted in these First Nations coming within the terms of the treaty. So there was a difference of opinion as to who are the real holders of the treaty. So what our law firm then, when they came out with this trust idea, it was, instead of taking it forward based on 21 First Nations, we would take it forward based on the beneficiaries that live in these communities. So it's like a class action lawsuit, really, is what it is, you know. But it's based on a representative action, is what the legal term that they used. So the representative action was based was put forward as a way to encompass all of the people in the First Nations. So naturally, because there were, you know, the people in those communities were governed by their chiefs and councils, we had to include all of the First Nations as decision makers on the process going forward. So that's how we were able to pull the First Nations together.
And I love that story because it's so, on the face of it, that 17 versus 21, it seems sort of like a deal breaker. That could have been a deal breaker.
It was a deal breaker for a good while.
And not just because people are stubborn or it just seems real hard to get around that. Yeah. So, and it was such a intelligent, thoughtful, and unifying strategy.
That's right. Yeah. So this innovative idea that Nawagabo Corbier law firm came up with, and the chiefs accepted it, gave us you know, a good process to move forward with the case. So then the trust then was given the mandate from the chiefs of the communities to carry the case forward into court.
Now, you have mentioned the role of elders in guiding this entire process, and I'm wondering, were they there from the very beginning? Was that guidance being shared since the 80s? At what point does this become part of the process?
All of the meetings that we've had with, I shouldn't say all, many of the meetings that we've had over the years in talking about this matter, a lot of elders sat with us in the discussions. They gave us their insights. They gave us their recommendations on how we should proceed. A lot of them were very traditional people, and they believed in doing things the Anishinaabe way. They told us that in order to move this thing forward, to satisfy our ancestors, who they know are always with us, although they're in another realm, they're always with us to assist us. And that's the spiritual aspect of moving the case forward. So what we did is we started to do some ceremonies because the First Nation elders told us that's what we have to do. We have to speak to the spirits of our ancestors, to ask them to help us make the right decisions, to guide us along through the process. So that was a big part of doing this is to include the elders, the traditional people to to move the case forward. So that's always been a big part of it. And one of the people that started with us at the start, I remember, was Gordon Wainemans. He's an elder from Shigwinda First Nation, and he was with us for many, many years. And he told us time and time again, you have to do this the right way if you're going to move this forward on behalf of Anishinaabe people. To do this in the right way. And to do this in the right way is to do it with ceremonies. So we did that, we did those ceremonies, we did those sweat lodge, those pipe ceremonies, and it helped us a lot. It brought us together under one purpose, and it was kind of like the glue that stuck us together.
Absolutely. And so, and you have suggested that some other things happened that were quite fortuitous uh, with the actual trial itself, with who was involved with the trial itself. It wasn't necessarily going to be in Sudbury, but that was decided by the lawyers that might be a good location.
Yeah, well, what happened is originally there was talk amongst the chiefs that we should have this trial in Toronto. Some talk about a court hearings in Ottawa as well, but that's outside of our territory. So then they decided, well, we should do it within our territory so that our people can be involved as well too. So we decided then to launch the court case in the Superior Court in Sudbury. That was a streak of luck that we did that because a justice of the Superior Court there, Madam Justice Hennessy, had just returned after a sabbatical where she wanted to learn about, uh, you know, the traditions of Anishinaabe people in the territory. And so she went away to study that for a little while, and then when she came
Unrelated
back,
to the case.
unrelated to the case,
That's something that happened
she
in
just
her
wanted
life.
to be
Yep.
a better judge in a courtroom where some Anishinaabe people, some First Nations people ended up in her court. She wanted to be able to understand their situation better, so she took that leave of absence to study that, to learn about it, and then when she came back, lo and behold, the court said, "This is the judge that can handle this case," because she's now got the background. So we were lucky that we got Justice Hennessy, who is very knowledgeable in, not that she is, how do you say that, apt to agree to our side just because she took.
She's not biased.
She's not biased.
She just has actual information.
She just has that learning,
Yeah.
that knowledge of First Nation situations.
She's not coming out the gate biased in the other direction.
That's right.
Which she would have
Yeah.
been if she didn't have.
Yeah, and it balances the process, and that's what First Nations look for when they through the court process is a balancing of cultures, traditions in the court system. What Justice Hennessy decided to do is she decided that we're going to accept in court some evidence from the Anishinaabe people on how they understand the treaty, it's not just one-sided where we look at only the documents and we look at the laws and we look at the court rulings that have been done in the past. Look at the history that was written mostly by non-native people about the treaty. She said she wanted to hear the Anishinaabe understanding of that. So our law firm did a whole process on getting those people to give us their ideas, their understandings. They told us how the treaty might have been understood in the Anishinaabe language in 1850, because most of those people there didn't understand English, and there was only a very few of them that understood English, and so they had to have interpreters there. So the elders talked about how that might have been understood. Those treaty terms might have been understood in the minds of those Anishinaabe people at the time. So that was a good part of the case, and it was a huge part of the case, and it was really welcomed by the judge, Justice Hennessy, and also by Canada and Ontario's legal teams, because they wanted to understand, how Native people understood the treaty as well. They wanted to understand it as well, so there was a coming together of those, the non-native, non-indigenous understanding of treaties and laws and stuff like that, and as well the Anishinaabe law, Anishinaabe culture, language, all of that came together in the courtroom, and that's the process that Justice Hennessy has got to deal with today, and trying to come up with a decision in this case.
So tell folks when the next moment is going to be in the trial process.
So we finished phase one. The trial, first of all, is broken into three phases. Through case management with the Justice Hennessy and the legal teams. There's 4 legal teams, by the way, in the case. I didn't mention that the Robinson Superior case, which deals with the identical wording in the Robinson Superior Treaty as the Robinson Huron Treaty, they are along bringing their case along at the same time as the Robinson Huron case in the court. So they have a legal team there as well. So 4 legal teams, Robinson Huron, Robinson Superior, Ontario, and Canada, dealing with this case with Justice Hennessy. They did case management meetings, and in the case management meetings they decided, they made some decisions on some things, that how they were going to proceed with the case. And I got off the rails.
I don't think you did.
No.
I think we're with you.
Okay.
I think though that I think there's a whole other conversation to be had about. I think there's lots more to say about the ceremonies and the way that's becoming part of the case, and I'd love to have that conversation another time. I was wondering if there was anything you'd like to add for this conversation, first of all, and then if there's any advice or words you have for folks out there who are trying to take up this struggle within the context of Canada.
Okay. Well, what Justice Hennessy and the lawyers decided to do is to break the case up into 3 phases. Phase 1 was a simple determination: is there a legal obligation in the treaty for the Crown to increase the annuities? That's phase 1. That was phase 1. Once the judge makes a decision on that, it's either a go forward or it stops. We lose, one or the other.
And when is that judgment coming?
That judgment is expected in December of this year.
Okay. So December 2018.
Yeah. So once we get by that, phase 2 of the trial has to do with legal, technical arguments that come with these types of cases that go into court. One is doctrine of laches, which basically means, to me anyway, and I'm just a layperson here, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm just saying that my understanding of that is you took too long to bring your case to court, and you can't bring it to court now because it prejudices the other party. The other one is statute of limitations. Statute of limitations says, okay, if we owe you money, you can't go back way back. That's too prejudicial. You can only go back so far. We don't think that's a fair argument, but that's for the judge to determine. And there's another one called res judicata, which means that the case has already been determined. There was a case in the 1890s between Canada and Ontario because of what happened in 1867 when the
Constitution?
when the BNA Act came into force.
Mm-hmm.
There was arguments between Canada and Ontario because the province of Ontario became responsible for Ontario,
Mm-hmm.
Quebec for itself, the rest of the provinces. Well, federal government said, well, Ontario is collecting all the money, so they should pay the annuity. Ontario said no. The treaty was signed with the Crown, which now the federal government is a representative of the Crown in Canada, so they should continue to pay. So anyway, this case went to trial. I think Canada, federal government lost. I think they had to, because they continued to pay the annuity. But at the same time, in those presentations, I guess, during that trial,
Which I'm sorry, that was in 1867? Or like in response
It was
to-
in the 1890s, I believe.
Okay,
it was.
okay.
Somewhere,
Wow.
I can't remember exactly the
You
date.
have to know history, you have to know the law, you have to know.
Yeah. So anyway, in this case, they said in that case that $4 was the limit. I guess, somebody said $4 is the limit in this case. That's all that's owing in this case. So once the judge or whoever was making decision at the time said it's $4 annuity. That's what it is. Well, First Nations were not party to that, and we would certainly have objected to that had we been party to that case. So we don't think that res judicata in this case is a very strong argument.
But Canada has asserted res judicata in the Robinson Huron case.
Yes.
So what if your average non-Indigenous Canadian hears this and thinks that's terrible, they shouldn't have done that? What can they do? Can they call up their MP and say, we want Canada not to make this fallacious argument? What do people do? How can folks support?
Yeah, and I don't know, like these are legal matters, I don't know that a person on the street can tell somebody, I don't think you should make that argument in court and you should drop it.
But I think the thing for me is that, I'm paying for Canada to make these arguments. I'm paying for them to hire these, in many cases, hack historians.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I should be able to say, I don't want you to hire those folks. I don't want you to say those things because they're speaking on my behalf, are they not?
Then if we get by this phase 2, which is those legal technical arguments, phase 3 of the case, if we get by all of those and we're still successful, we're still going through the court system, phase 3 is determining the amount of compensation owing. So that's where we hope to be at some point. We hope to be able to do that in between while the case is going. We hope to be able to sit down with Canada and Ontario and say, how can we settle this without going through the whole process of going through the court system?
Which is an offer you have put on the table since the very beginning. You have always been ready to sit at a side table and talk.
That's right. In 2012, we took this case to the Attorneys General of Canada and Ontario, and we said to both Crown governments, here's the case. We are prepared to take this case to court. We're asking you to sit down and settle the matter out of court. We didn't get any responses from that.
So they didn't even say no, they just didn't.
Really, they didn't say no. They didn't
just
say
didn't even
yes.
say anything.
They didn't say anything. Really.
Ouch.
So, 2 years later, 2014,
There you go.
we launched our case in court. We had a ceremony in Sudbury. We had a sweat lodge. We had a pipe ceremony. We had a sacred fire there, and we had a teaching session where we invited elders to come in and talk to us about what treaties mean. Alan Corbier, who's one of the elders that we use, he's very knowledgeable when it comes to the Crown Indigenous relationship in the area. He spoke about these treaty belts, how they're interpreted by Anishinaabe people. It was really an interesting time, and so we launched the case in court in 2014. Here we are today.
Here we are.
Yep.
Here we are. What's your word for the people out there?
I think that, you know, if someone wants to help with this, I think it's important to help us to get the word out, because this case doesn't only involve First Nation people, not just the people of the 21 First Nations here and the government. It includes everybody. It involves everybody. This case, depending on how it comes out of the court, will have huge ramifications for other treaties across Canada. So if you're an Indigenous person and you want the courts to understand how you understand a treaty in Canada, you should talk to people about that. You should you should bring that stuff out. Today with social media, you can do all of those kinds of things, and you can do them often and get the word out, you know. Let people know that this is happening. Make sure that people understand what the issues are. Do some research, you know, and try to put those things forward, and so that in the end we can all live in a better society in our country. Miigwech.